You didn't just get one hard thing, you got all of them. At the same time, the health thing, the money thing, the relationship that's falling apart, the job that's not working, the family situation that won't resolve, the anxiety that won't leave, maybe a loss you're still processing while trying to hold everything else together. And the worst part isn't the pain itself. The worst part is the timing, because any one of these you could handle. You've handled hard things before, but all of them, simultaneously, with no break in between, that's a different category of experience. That feels less like a trial and more like a demolition. And the question you keep coming back to, the one you're almost afraid to say out loud, is this: what did I do to deserve all of this at once? I want to offer you a different question. What if you didn't do anything to deserve it? What if all of this at once isn't punishment, but a very specific kind of construction? What if the reason it's happening simultaneously is precisely because God is building something that requires a total overhaul, not a patch job? Here's what the Bible shows us about the seasons when everything hits at once. And I think by the end of this, you're going to see your situation completely differently. Let's start with a man named Job. If you know anything about Job, you know he's the go-to example of suffering in Scripture. But I think most people misunderstand why his story is so important. They focus on the fact that he suffered, but the more significant detail is how he suffered specifically, the timing. Job 1, verses 13 through 19. In a single day, Job received 4 separate pieces of devastating news. One messenger arrived. His oxen and donkeys had been stolen, his servants killed. Before that man finished speaking, a second messenger arrived. Fire had fallen from the sky, killing his sheep and more servants. Before that man finished speaking, a third arrived. His camels had been raided, more servants killed. And before that one could finish, a fourth messenger arrived with news that ended Job's world entirely. A wind had collapsed the house where all 10 of his children were gathered. None of them survived. 4 messengers, one right after another, not spread out over months or years. One day. And then, because apparently that wasn't enough, Job was later struck with painful sores from the top of his head to the soles of his feet. His wife told him to curse God and die. His 3 closest friends sat with him in silence for 7 days, and then proceeded to spend the next several chapters insisting that he must have sinned to deserve this. Job lost his wealth, his children, his health, his social standing, his marriage in spirit if not in law, and his friendships, all in rapid succession, wave after wave after wave. Now here's the critical question. Was this random? Was this just cosmic bad luck? Or was something else happening? Because here's what the text reveals that Job did not know. In the opening chapters, God himself had pointed Job out to Satan as a man of extraordinary character. God essentially said, "Have you considered my servant Job? There's no one on earth like him." The suffering that followed wasn't proof that God had forgotten Job. It was evidence that God considered him uniquely capable of enduring and emerging from what was about to happen. The suffering wasn't the end of Job's story. It was the entrance to a deeper relationship with God than he had ever had before. By the end of the book, God speaks to Job directly, something that doesn't happen to most of the people in Scripture, and restores everything he lost, doubled. But none of that is visible from inside the storm. From inside the storm, it just looks like everything falling apart at once. Here's the first thing you need to understand. When God is doing a deep work, he often works on multiple things at the same time. Not because he's cruel, but because the things he's building in you are interconnected. Think about how a building is constructed. When you look at a building mid-construction, it looks like chaos. There are workers on every floor, different crews doing completely different things simultaneously. Plumbing, electrical, framing, foundation work still happening in some areas, while the roof is going up in others. From the outside, it looks like a disaster. Unfinished walls, exposed beams, holes in the floor. If you didn't know a building was being constructed, you'd think the building was being destroyed. But the architect knows what's happening. Every crew, every team, every part of the chaos has a role in the finished structure. Nothing is random, and critically, you can't finish the electrical after the walls are closed. You can't pour the foundation after the frame is up. Certain things have to happen at the same time because they depend on each other. God doesn't patch you up piece by piece and send you back out. When He's building something significant in a life, He tends to work on all the broken places at once, because the fear, the pride, the self-reliance, the wrong dependencies, the identity built on unstable ground, those things are all connected. You can't fully fix one without addressing the others. So He addresses all of them at the same time. The simultaneous nature of your current season isn't evidence of randomness. It may actually be evidence of intentionality. Israel's wilderness experience makes this exact point. When God led the people out of Egypt, He didn't ease them into difficulty gradually. He marched them into the desert, where they immediately faced hunger, thirst, and an attack from the Amalekites, all at the same time. Hunger, thirst, war, not in sequence, concurrently. Different kinds of need hitting the same people at the same moment. Why? Deuteronomy 8:2 tells us directly. God says, "Remember how the Lord your God led you all the way in the wilderness these 40 years, to humble you and to test you in order to know what was in your heart." The purpose of the simultaneous pressure was not to break them. It was to reveal what was in them, so that what needed to be built could be built on what was actually there, not on what they assumed was there. The wilderness didn't just test their faith. It showed them what their faith was actually made of, and it showed God what He had to work with, not because He didn't know, but because they needed to know. This is the part people don't want to hear, but it's the part that changes everything. When multiple things fall apart at the same time, there's often a pattern to what is falling. It tends to be the things you've been depending on for your security, your identity, or your peace. The relationship that was holding you together emotionally. The job that was giving you your sense of worth. The financial cushion that made you feel like you were in control. The friendship that was serving as your substitute for genuine community with God. None of those things are wrong in themselves. But there's a version of relying on them that quietly displaces God, where you stop really needing Him because these other things are meeting your needs well enough. And God, who loves you too much to let that continue indefinitely, will sometimes allow every earthly cushion to be removed so that what remains is just you and Him. This sounds harsh. It's actually mercy. In the wilderness, Israel was eating food they had stored from Egypt. They had resources. Then the resources ran out, and God sent manna. But notice what the manna required. They had to collect it fresh every morning. They couldn't store it. If they tried to keep extra for the next day, it rotted. Every single morning, they had to go out and receive provision that was only available that day. This was by design. God was training them to depend on Him daily, not quarterly or annually, to need Him not in crisis moments but in ordinary ones. He does the same thing with us. And sometimes the only way to get us there is to remove what we've been storing and trusting instead of Him. Paul understood this from the inside. In 2 Corinthians 1:8-9, he writes about a time of suffering so severe that he says they despaired of life itself. He says, "We felt we had received the sentence of death, but this happened that we might not rely on ourselves, but on God." He names the purpose explicitly. The suffering that made him despair of his own life happened so that his reliance would shift permanently from his own strength to God. What is being removed from your life right now? Not as punishment, but as construction. What has God been gently asking you to trust Him with that you kept managing on your own? The simultaneous pressure often targets exactly those areas, because the new thing God is building in you can't be built on old foundations. The old ones have to go first. Here's what I want you to sit with. A single trial builds patience. A single trial builds perseverance. A single trial can deepen your faith in one area, but the kind of character God builds in people He's preparing for significant use that requires compound pressure, multiple things at once. Because the character needed to carry a heavy calling is a character that holds up under multidimensional stress, not just one kind of suffering. Think about what Job became by the end of his story. The man who could say, from the depths of simultaneous, devastating loss, "Though he slay me, yet will I hope in him." That's not a verse that comes from one bad week. That's a statement forged in the kind of suffering that stripped away every other hope, every other explanation, every other comfort, until what remained was a faith that existed for no external reason whatsoever, a faith that couldn't be taken away because it was no longer attached to anything that could be taken. That kind of faith doesn't come from easy seasons, and it doesn't come from one hard thing at a time. It comes from the exact kind of season you might be in right now. Paul goes further. Romans 5:3-4. We also glory in our sufferings, because we know that suffering produces perseverance, perseverance, character, and character, hope. That's a chain, and notice that it only works in sequence. You can't skip from suffering to hope. Suffering produces perseverance. Perseverance produces character. Character produces hope. Every link requires the one before it. And here's what I want you to notice. Paul doesn't say a single suffering, as if one trial is sufficient to produce the full chain. The Greek word he uses is the plural. Sufferings. Multiple. The depth of hope Paul is describing, the unshakable kind, the kind that doesn't put us to shame, comes from layered, repeated, multi-directional suffering that builds the chain one link at a time. The simultaneous nature of your current season may be accelerating what God is building, not because He's impatient with you, but because He knows what He's making and He knows how much time is needed. And sometimes, when the calling is significant, the construction has to move fast. There's a pattern in the Bible that once you see it, you can't unsee it. Every major figure who was used by God in a significant way went through a season of maximum compression immediately before the breakthrough. Joseph, 17 years old, thrown in a pit by his brothers, sold into slavery, falsely accused, thrown in prison, forgotten. The years don't trickle in, they compound. Slavery leads to accusation, leads to prison, leads to being overlooked. Compression upon compression. And then in what reads as almost an overnight turn, he's standing before Pharaoh, interpreting a dream, and by the end of the conversation, he's second in command over all of Egypt. Maximum compression. Then maximum release. Paul on the road to Damascus. In one moment, blinded, knocked to the ground, his entire worldview shattered, every confidence he had about who he was and what he was doing, obliterated. He was led by the hand into Damascus, the man who had come to Damascus to lead others away, now unable to lead himself across a street, blind, fasting, alone for 3 days with nothing but the ruin of his old identity and no clear picture of what would replace it. Maximum compression. Then Ananias arrives. Scales fall from his eyes, and Paul becomes the man who will write most of the New Testament and carry the gospel across the Roman Empire. The compression is always proportional to the release. The narrower the passage, the larger what's waiting on the other side. Now, I want to be careful here. I'm not promising you that relief is 3 days away. It might be 3 years. For some of the people in Scripture, the compression lasted decades. Joseph waited 13 years. Moses waited 40. What I'm saying is not that the release is near. What I'm saying is that the pattern is consistent. The seasons of maximum compression in the Bible are almost never the end of the story. They're the threshold, and you are not in the middle of an ending. You may be standing at the threshold of something you cannot yet see. So what do you actually do with all of this? Because theology that doesn't touch the ground isn't enough. When you're in the middle of all of it at once, You don't just need a framework, you need something to hold on to today. First, stop explaining it away. Most people in the middle of compound suffering spend enormous energy trying to figure out which sin caused which trial, as if they could fix the right thing and make it stop. Job's friends did this. They were wrong. Not every season of difficulty is punitive. Some of it is constructive. Stop confessing things that may not need to be confessed, and start asking a different question. Not what did I do, but what are you building? Second, let the multiple things be multiple things. Don't try to collapse it into one explanation. This is happening because of X, when X only accounts for one of the 5 things on your list. The simultaneous nature of this season may mean that God is working on multiple things at once, and each of them may have a different purpose. Let it be complex. God is not confused by the complexity. Third, do what Job did in the middle of it, not what he did at the end, when everything was restored. What he did in the middle, in the ash heap, with the sores and the grief and the friends who weren't helping. He kept talking to God, not politely, not with composed Sunday morning prayers. He argued, he questioned, he accused, he poured everything out. And in doing so, he maintained the one thing that mattered, the conversation. The relationship stayed open. He didn't walk away. And because he didn't walk away, God could speak to him eventually, out of the storm, in a way that was more intimate than anything Job had experienced before the suffering started. The middle of everything at once is not the time to go quiet with God. It's the time to be loudest. Fourth, watch for what's being revealed, not just what's being removed. The things being taken in this season are showing you what you were built on. The things emerging in you, the faith you didn't know you had, the clarity about what actually matters, the compassion for others in pain that you didn't have before. Those things are the first visible evidence of what's being built. Pay attention to them. They're the scaffolding of what's coming. The book of Job ends with a scene I don't think gets enough attention. After everything, after all of it, God speaks to Job's 3 friends, the ones who sat with him and told him he must have sinned, who gave confident explanations for suffering they didn't understand, and God says to them, "You have not spoken of me what is right, as my servant Job has." Think about what Job said about God in the middle of his suffering. He said God wasn't answering him. He said he felt abandoned. He accused God of treating him unfairly. He demanded an audience. He said things that would make most Christians uncomfortable in a church setting. And God said, "That's the one who spoke rightly about me, not the friends with the tidy explanations, not the ones who had everything figured out, the one who stayed in the conversation, the one who refused to let God out of the wrestling match even when God seemed absent, the one who kept insisting that his relationship with God was real enough to be angry about, close enough to demand answers from." God is not afraid of your questions. He's not fragile in the face of your frustration. He would rather have your raw, honest, confused, desperate engagement than your polished silence. So, if you are in the middle of everything hitting at once, keep talking, keep wrestling, keep demanding, keep insisting that the God who started this has a plan that justifies the cost of it, because he does. And the fact that you're still here, still fighting to make sense of it, still searching for meaning in what feels like demolition, that's not weakness. That's the construction in progress.